My talk today is called But How? Methods and Techniques to Making a Good User Interface. The reason for the but how is because that is the question I've been met with so many times by developers. Because most developers today are perfectly aware that usability is a key point when it comes to making user interfaces. They also know all the things that you should strive for, but they don't know what methods and techniques to use to actually achieve this. So I know I have to make a good user interface, I know it's key, I know it's important. How? That's what we're going to look at today. Just a really quick run through of what makes good usability. There are tons of guidelines out there are tons of ways of defining what good usability is. But over the years I have accumulated these 10 guidelines, and I think if you covered in those 10, you're pretty well covered overall. First one, simple and natural dialogue. What this means is that the dialogue, because that is what you can see it as, the dialogue that the user has with his or her computer should be simple and natural. And that doesn't mean natural language of the computer, that means natural language of the user. Don't speak computer language to the user, because they usually don't get it. That goes to the second one, speak the user's language. That doesn't mean that you can't speak business language of some sort. I mean, people like in the health industry, you can have nurses that are using it, and they will have their own language of their own area of expertise, and it's okay to speak that. Just don't speak your area of expertise's language, meaning don't speak computer language to them, because that's usually not their trade, and they won't get it. Minimize memory load. All in all, people are really bad at remembering stuff. Computers are really good at it, and nevertheless, we tend to have a tendency of making the user remember rather than making the computer remember. That's what it's good at. Make use of it. Use constructive error messages. So many times you get an error message with some kind of hex code and some kind of pointer to a memory area or something. It doesn't tell me squat. I'm a software engineer, it still doesn't tell me squat. Don't do it. And then people go the next step and they say, an error occurred. Well, duh, I got that. I want to know why it occurred. I want to know what I can do about it. Those are the two things you want in error messages. It's fairly obvious that an error occurred. I want to know why and what I can do about it, because I don't want to be stuck here, I want to be able to move on. Support recall. It is a lot easier for human beings to recollect something from before than having to remember something out of thin air. Meaning, if you can give them a finite amount of choices, they will be able to recognize in those choices what they're looking for, rather than giving them a free text field that they have to fill out on their own. So make recall an integrated part of what you do. It's a lot easier than having to use free memory. Make clear exits. That means never get the user into a corner where they don't know how to get out again. There's a reason there's so many websites where the back button fucks things up. Basically because that is what users resort to when you don't give them an exit. Then they'll start using that and go back until they find an area of the website where they can move in another direction. Always give them exits. Always make sure that if they've cornered themselves, okay, this is not what you wanted, I know that, here's the exit. That's how you move on from there. Make shortcuts. Shortcuts are brilliant. The reason shortcuts are brilliant is because it caters to the expert users, but without bothering the novice users. Most people have some shortcuts incorporated into what they do on a daily basis. So they use Control-C and Control-V and Control-X, and then they move on to Control-A and Control-S and all these different commands. And if you become a super user, you basically know all of your control commands. The good thing about those is that they don't bother the novice user. Usually you don't discover shortcuts until you're ready to start using them. And then you gradually incorporate them into what you do. So that's one way of making a system that has to cater to a broad spectrum of users when it comes to experience. That's one way of doing it. Give feedback. Always tell the user what's going on. Users don't have faith in computer systems. They don't have faith in them doing what they should. They don't have faith in anything working the way it should. Make sure you tell them if something goes wrong. That's the error messages. But also tell them when something goes right. Because if they don't get the message that something installed successfully, they aren't sure, because it's happened before that things didn't install successfully. So also tell them when something goes right. Also tell them how far into a process you are. If it's a process the user is controlling, tell them how many steps there are. If it's a process the computer is in the middle of, such as installing stuff, tell them how long they have to wait. Is it enough time to go get a cup of coffee, or should I take a vacation to southern France? Prevent errors. That's even better. It's good to use constructive error messages, but it's even better if we can prevent the errors. If we can anticipate where it is they're going to run into problems, make sure that you do what you can to make sure that it never happens in the first place. And then finally, thrive for consistency. People tend to pull on what they've learned in the past. So you want to make sure that what they learned in the past also applies in your software and in the future, because that's what they're going to try. Alan was talking about it with the gestures. Because there's no consistency in the gestures used across platforms, people get into trouble when they move to a different platform. They start using gestures that used to work on another platform, and all of a sudden it's doing something else, and they can't figure out how to get around it. So thrive for consistency in your software. All right, so that's what we're thriving for, those usability principles, to have them fulfilled. But we want to, there's tons of different techniques and methods that can be applied during a process of developing software. One of the early ones is a creative design workshop. What that does is give you an idea of where we're headed with this. We in Trifork, we make apps. It happens very often that a customer comes in and say, we would like to have an app. Okay. What would you like that app to do? We don't know. We just want an app. That's when you start turning to something like this. Because then you start getting to know the domain, you start getting to know the company that you're working with, the users they have, what it is that makes them tick, what needs they have, all that sort of thing. Get that uncovered, and you can do that with a creative workshop. The reason you can do that is because you bring stakeholders together. You bring the designers in, you bring the domain experts in, you bring the users in, and you bring the developers in. The reason for having all of these in the same room is because that way you get the input that they're strong in. The developers know what is technically possible. The designers know what cool designs they've seen around the world and how well that works with users. The users know what they want support for with what they do on a daily basis. And finally, the domain experts know the broader spectrum of the area that you're developing for. Set the scene. The purpose of this workshop is design ideas. We want to get design ideas. We want to find out what it is we're making and why we're making it. And the time frame is at least 4 hours, but rather 6 hours or more. If you have a full day, that's usually plenty. We make groups, 2 to 3 groups of 3 to 4 people each. We don't want to be more than 12 people, because then it becomes too many chefs. And you want to mix the profiles in each group, so you don't put the developers all in one group. Put a developer in each group, a designer in each group, a user in each group, because then that way they can feed off what each other know. And the materials, it's the same as for making Christmas decorations. And the reason for that is because then we're all on the same playing field. Everybody knows how to use scissors and crayons and tape. And there's a tendency, if we don't use something like this, then people bring out their laptops. And then if you're dealing with a bunch of users who are not used to IT, they feel inferior. They won't contribute as much. This levels the playing field for everybody. And it doesn't mean you have to be good at drawing. I can't draw a stick man. It just means that we can all use it. We've done it before. Outline the project briefly. What are we making? To who? And why? If you can answer those 3, you're quite far ahead. Provide the necessary knowledge of the platforms. That means if you are developing something for a tablet, tell the audience at the workshop what are the characteristics of a tablet. One of the rules there is use the platform, use all of the hardware that's in there. Don't just make something that in principle could be printed out on paper and put in your pocket. You want to use the GPS, you want to use the camera, you want to use the ability to play videos, all this sort of thing. You want to use the platform, otherwise there's no point in making something for a tablet. So introduce them to the platform so they know what we're dealing with here. And then, of course, explain the process. Yes, it is cutting and pasting the old-fashioned way, because usually they don't believe that when they arrive. And make sure that they see possibilities, not limitations. We have a tendency of shooting down ideas before they even have a chance to fly. Tell them that imagine for this one day that we had enough money, we had enough time, we had all technology in the world. What would you dream up? What would the ultimate system be to support your everyday task in a specific area? We can always shoot them down again. That doesn't take long. But let them dream for this one day, because it will give you an idea of what their mental view of their area is and what they're struggling with on a daily basis. And then, of course, conclude by a presentation where all of the groups from before present what they've been making. And the reason we do multiple groups is because they never make the same. And there's never a group that makes the one perfect application. It's usually they had something really neat with this part of the application, they had really done something in this part of the application. So you make a hybrid in the end, and you actually pull the best ideas from each group. The reason it works is because everybody knows how to use the materials. And pictures say more than 1,000 words. You can always make a list of demands for a system, and you can write, and you can write, and you can write. And then when people have to actually realize what you put in writing, they do something different. Picture says more than 1,000 words. It really is true. It's not computers, so it levels the playing field, like I said. It gives you a unique insight into others' view of the field. And that's very useful, because if you don't put the developers together with the users, they usually don't know who they're developing for. They usually don't know what their problem is. They don't know what problem they're solving either. Benefiting from each other's area of expertise. Everybody's contributing with what they know most about. The developers are contributing technology, the users are contributing their area of expertise, and so on and so forth. It provides the designer with insight. This is gold for me to have a workshop like that, because I go away with so much knowledge of what can be done, what should be done, what ought to be done, and so on and so forth. It's gold for me. And it supports the visual imagination. And it's very concrete. This is down to, actually making a frame. This is one screen. Where do we want to go from there? When I click there, I want to go to that screen. It becomes very concrete. We're not just talking abstract ideas here. We're actually realizing them, if nothing else than just on paper. So this is just an example of what it looks like. And as you can see, we might as well just be making Christmas decorations. There's tons of stuff on the table. Everybody's talking, everybody's walking around, using the boards, putting stuff up, making wireframes and arrows in between the different screens and everything like that. It's super useful to have something like that. And the outcome can be very different depending on what you're making. But as you can see, it's not necessary to be able to draw perfectly. You don't have to be a designer or an architect or something like that, because it's very clear that, well, that's an image, that's a title of the image. There's a menu here, there's some headlines here with some text under, some pictures here. This might be an advertising, I don't know. It's very clear what it is, even though it's very, very minimal what you've drawn. And you have a very clear idea of what you're making later. So what comes out of it is first and foremost design ideas. It's also potential problem areas. We find these key points in the application where we can see we're going to run into problems. It might be technical problems, things that aren't actually available to us, but that would be really neat if they were. That means the developers go into their corner and start digging and see if anybody has made anything like that before. It might also be problem areas for the user. This is really, really where we need support. This is something that we need solved. It gives a better understanding of the domain for everybody, not just for me, but for everybody. It has a heightened engagement from all parties, and this is important. Everybody are stakeholders. This is everybody's baby now, not just mine, not just developers. This is everybody's baby. So there's a shared ownership of the solution. Everybody is proud of it. Everybody wants it to succeed. You get rid of a lot of politics this way. because people aren't fighting each other. People are actually working together and making this together. So that's one way of starting. Then the second, or one of the next things that is usually quite useful is we need to know who is the user. I think most developers in here at some point have argued that my mom wouldn't be able to use this, right? Yeah, I see you nodding, yeah. That might be true, but would your mom be the typical profile of the end user? Often not. So perception of what your user is varies. It can be my mom, it can be the latest customer you had, and you presume this is the same. It can be stereotypes if it's a user group you haven't really met before. Are they old, are they young, are they novice, are they experts? What's their gender, what's their occupation? There's lots of stuff to know about your user. Imagine for a second that I showed you a chart of all colors, all Pantone colors of blue, and asked each of you to pick one. What are the odds you would pick the same color? Not very high, right? It's the same with users. Each and every one of you would have a different envisioning of your user in your head. And because of that, you are developing in different directions. You are talking past each other when you're talking about problems that need solving. You need to have a shared idea of who your user is. And that's where personas come in. Personas is a description of your user. You need to base it on your users, of course. And if you haven't met them, go meet them. They don't bite, most of the time. What do they have in common? So find out what is the shared trade or trades across your user groups. What varies? That's just as important. Are there different profiles you need to be aware of? Group all of the attributes you find for your users into roles, and then convert those roles into persona. This is one example of a persona. So you have name and age. It's very good to have a picture as well, because it makes it more personal. It makes it more believable. And you have a shared idea of who you're referring to. So please add a picture. It doesn't have to be of the actual user. Find a picture that fits. Put in their occupation, their IT or domain experience. Put in a tagline, such as a motto or a life way of living, or just a tagline that says something unique about the personality of this person. Put in a bit about their personality, and put in anything else that might be of interest. For instance, in this one, they put in what kind of car he drives. That's because what they're making is a website for a car dealership. Then that's actually relevant, if it's a car enthusiast or not. Otherwise, it might not be relevant. If you're making something for the health system, you might not need to know what car they're driving. But put in anything that is important as part of the domain you're dealing with. Also look at the context. Do they work alone, or do they work together with whatever they do in their daily life? Is it leisure or is it work? So that means, is it something that their boss says they should use, or is it something that they use whenever they want to? What platform is it on? How often do they use it? All of these types of things you need to uncover. And then once you're done, you choose one primary and two secondary personas, because you'll usually, initially you'll end up with like 10 different personas, and it's too many to keep in your head at once. So see if you can bundle them up, see if you can make one personas out of 3 or 4 of them, and combine them, and then end up with one primary and two secondary, because that's what most people can keep in their head. Start referring to them by name when you are making decisions. When you're discussing a certain thing, should we do it this way or that way? Well, Peter would think that this and da 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 da, and it will actually be based on the same shared experience of who Peter is and what his preferences are. So use it when you sketch, use it when you design, prototype, code. In all of the process, use your personas, refer to them. You have a shared vision of who your user is. What would my persona do, prefer, think in a certain situation? That will often answer your questions. And if it doesn't answer it right away, it will at least spark a good discussion. A discussion that actually takes hold in who your user is, rather than my mom. These are another couple of examples. And as you see, it doesn't need to be all neat and pretty. It's basically just a one-pager, handwritten, with a picture on it. It's the work that goes into it that decides how well they work. The design process, because we've uncovered what we're making. We know who we're making it for as well. Now we need to go into the design process. How do we go about this? Well, as most of you developers know, coding and then having to recode is a hassle. It takes time, it's inconvenient, it pressures the time plan and all that. So we want to do as little recoding as possible. What do we do to avoid that? The more specific we are about what we're making before we actually sit down and code it, the less risk of having to recode. So sketch everything you're doing. This is the first sketch for Danske Bank's app for the mobile. How many of you know that one? Quite a few. That's what I was hoping. That's why I took that as an example. This is the part of the app where you can find your nearest bank branch if you're looking to take out money or put in money or whatever. And basically, this is a map. And there's a few pins, and what it shows is that when you press a pin, a little box comes up and it tells you something about that specific pin. You can switch between list and map here, and there's a couple of other buttons. That takes about 3 minutes to draw, but it gives you a very good idea of, is that what I want or is that not what I want? You can easily move buttons around, you can easily add buttons as you go along. That way you know what you're talking about. Of course, what you don't know when you have a sketch like that is, how much can I actually fit into that box by the pin? Because my handwriting is significantly bigger and more unreadable than what the computer can make. So start making it a bit nicer. This is drawn in Word, not even drawn in any drawing program, because that takes too long. Just like that, no colors, no rounded edges, no shadows, lights, and all that stuff. Just to give you an idea of how much will it actually take up, will it fit into the screen? And then once you're happy with it, once your customer has nodded and said, yeah, that's what we're after, that will solve our problem. Then you start making graphics, because redoing graphics will take just as long as recoding. So you don't want him to make, or her, making graphics at that point. You want to do this first. And then you can start fiddling with shadows and rounded edges and all those really polished things. And that's when you start coding, when you have all of that. But this process, making this back roll from here, if this is not what we're after, it doesn't take very long. I do like that, draw for another 3 minutes, and off we go. So unless it's really simple code, I guess you can't do it in 3 minutes. So that's the process, and that will save a lot of coding time if you're really clear on what you're making before you actually start coding anything. You can even do usability tests on this. I'll come back to that in a minute. But that's just one screen. It doesn't give you an idea of the flow. But that can be done on all 3 stages. So as you can see here, this is some of the wireframes I've drawn for a nature app, looking for plants and animals and stuff. And what you do, you draw each screen, you scan it in, and then you start fiddling around with the pictures, and then you just start adding arrows, making sure that you have all the screens, making sure that you don't get any corners where the user doesn't have any exit and can't get out. And this one, where you've actually put it into the computer, into just Word or whatever, PowerPoint, it doesn't matter, and you start adding arrows. So you know that the flow is the way it should be. And actually also when you get the graphics on, you have the workflow as well. It gives you an idea of, have I missed anything? Is there any weird loops where I can't get out? Stuff like that. So this gives you an idea as well. Card sorting. This is another technique. This technique is very good for structuring. Because now we saw the workflow, and on an app, it's not such a big deal because you don't usually have huge menus, but on websites, when you have your main menu, what should each point be named? What should be under each point? So I come to a website and there's a contact and there's an about us. There might be a press. Where do I find jobs? I don't know. Where do I find this, that, and the other? This can help you. Card sorting can come in either as an open card sorting or a closed card sorting. And it gives you an insight into the mental model of the user. it informs the navigational structure based on this insight into their mental model. Because if you know how they think things belong together, then you can make your navigational structure reflect that. So what happens is, you can have a deck of cards like that, with every single point you want somewhere on your website. Any page on your website should go on there. And you can have up to 250 cards like that. That's a lot. What you make the user do is sort them, group them. Say, okay, these 250 cards, group them as you think they belong together.
You mean 256, right?
Yeah, of course. I forgot who I was talking to for a second. 256, sorry. You ask them to group them together. And they will start and they will make these different groups. And then they realize, okay, this group is kind of large. And now I think I'll split it up and make it into 2 subgroups. And then, okay, I have this one card. I thought I was starting a group over here, but it doesn't really seem like there's anything else that belong with it. So, okay, so where do I put that after then? And they will fiddle about with it for a while. And then you'll end up with a number of groups. You don't know how many. And you don't know how many cards are in each of them. Ask the user to name each group. What would they call it? And there you are. There's your menu and your submenus, what you find under each of them. And what you want to do then, to check that you got it right, is that you take the names they gave all of the groups, then you give those names to another group of users, along with the cards, and ask them to sort them into those groups. And hopefully you'll get the same groups. If you don't, then you'll know that the cards that ended up in 2 places, there might actually be a bias. They might actually be able to belong to both. What do we do then? We might actually put them both places. That way, one half of the users who think it belongs in that group will go there, the other half will go the other place, and nobody will be disappointed. The only problem you might get is if there are certain cards that they don't really think belong anywhere. Then you might be missing a group somewhere. But this informs your structure very, very well. And it means that your users, in the end, can actually find what they're looking for in your website, or whatever else it is you're making. For instance, this one. Everybody knows this one, I'm quite sure. How many people were frustrated when they went from the old menu system to the ribbon? Yeah. Why? Because you couldn't find anything, right? All of the things you knew where was, or where it used to be, you couldn't find it anymore. People were so frustrated, and people were so angry at Microsoft for making this change. But Microsoft, like it or not, they actually do make informed choices. They don't just make a major change to a major program that everybody in the world uses on a whim. Here's some of the key highlights from the design process of the ribbon. The genesis of the ribbon came out of an analysis of 1.3 billion user sessions. Each one of these user sessions had more than 6,600 data points. As the design of the ribbon evolved, we did card sorting in both directions, so opened and closed. We asked one group to sort functions into groups and name the groups. We asked the second group to take the groups from the first card sorting exercise and sort functions back into those groups. The sorting matched up, meaning you got it right. And based on how many users they have put into this, this actually works. The reason that you guys don't know where anything is because you'd gotten used to the old way. Even if they didn't make particularly sense, you had finally become able to remember where everything was. The reason this was a success is because the group that wasn't loud, meaning all the new users who weren't particularly verbal about whether or not they liked it, they really liked it. And it took a lot less time to learn where everything was in this new system than in the old world. But the loudmouths, the people that use it every day, people who are opinionated just like us in this room, we were very loud about it, and that's why they got flagged for it. But it is actually a much better sorting of things based on empirical data than what we had before. Just an example. I apologize for anybody who doesn't speak Danish. This is from a Danish website, but it's a favorite example of mine because it's very, very good to illustrate this. This is from a website that compares prices on hardware and software and technical gadgets of all sorts. And That main menu of theirs has grown and grown over the years. At the moment, it's 10 menu points. Where do I find a headset in there?
Hardware.
Yeah? Accessories? Sound? Telephony. Yeah? So that's 4 different places where you could be looking for a headset. Where do I find a network card for my computer? Network or hardware?
That's the same word.
Yeah? But that's the thing. Why, if I look at this, what is the problem with the categories on this one? Why are there so many places that can hold the same thing? Come on. They overlap, yeah. Somebody over here? They're too big, yeah. No, true. The level of abstraction is different, because if you look at it, I could just take the hardware and software and put those 2 there, and I didn't need anything else. Because whatever is under all of the others would fall under one of those 2. So those are actually the top levels. And then you have a number of levels below. But those below don't cover all aspects. And that's why they've introduced software and hardware on this level as well, because that's the default. That's where you put everything that doesn't fit anywhere else. So this is actually a brilliant example of when a menu happens ad hoc. Along the way, it shoots as the website grows over the years, and there hasn't been made a specific effort to actually make a decent menu here. And that could be done in a day with card sorting. All right, but there are other things to design in a website or whatever else we're making than just the menu. And just like the developers know there are design patterns, there's also such a thing as interaction design patterns. That means don't reinvent the wheel. Don't reinvent a new way of going through a web shop and paying for your goods, because there are actually ways that are best practices in that today, and that works, and that everybody can find their way through. So don't start making up new things here. Same thing for menus. Start using some of the usual menu structures that are common and that everybody knows. So have a top menu and then have sub-menus under that, or have a top menu and then have the sub-menu in the left, or something that is the way it usually is. And that people, the reason that this works, the reason that this is good to use, is because it supports the recall I was talking about. People recall this structure from every other website on the web, and they know how to use it. So they don't have to bother with that. They can actually move on and start looking for the goods and start buying stuff from you instead of having to learn how to navigate your site. So look up interaction design patterns if you are making something that you have a hunch has been made before, and that you have a hunch will have best practices, because there's no point in reinventing the wheel. And I know some of you out here are thinking, well, then my website will look like everybody else's. Where's the new stuff? How do I stick out of the crowd? Don't stand out of the crowd by making something the user can't use, because you don't want to be remembered as the one website they couldn't navigate. That's not a way to stand out. Well, it is, but it's not the way you want to stand out. Stand out by having a really nice graphical design, for instance. Something unique there. Stand out by being the website where people think to themselves when they're done after 5 minutes, wow, that's the fastest I've ever shopped anything on the web. That's the way you want to stand out. Not by making something the user can't use. There's also a method called progressive disclosure. And what it means is you devise, simplify, and let the user conquer your website or your app or whatever it is you're making. Because many apps, websites, programs, systems today are so large that if you present everything to the user at once, they will get overwhelmed. So start using steps. You want to use steps if you have long, complex tasks. Group it into steps. Everybody knows them, wizards everywhere. But there's a reason that wizards are so popular. That's because they work. Group it into some logical steps, and then let the user take one step at a time. It avoids the overload of the user memory, because if you present one long form to them on an e-commerce site, for instance, it's like, I can't be bothered. I'll go to another website. There's just as many fields and forms on the other website, but because it's been split up, I can overlook each of the steps. Make levels. If you have multiple levels of user experience in your group of users, make levels. It means that you can make gradual introduction to whatever it is you're introducing them to, and present only the basics to them to begin with. But if they know where to look, then they can get into the more advanced options. And this is particularly for advanced setup or detailed descriptions, stuff like that, where you don't want to present it all at once. Again, this is a website, a Danish website that sells flowers. Fairly common place. And they have really got it down to an art with the step-by-step. Because you start out and then you choose a bouquet of flowers. You choose the price, you press order. That's nice and easy. And then you think you're going to go and pay. But no, then you get the option of adding additional things. So do you want chocolate with that, wine with that, a card with that, whatever? Yeah, it is. But you're already in the process. And then you see, okay, yeah, I'll fill this one out, and then I'll move on.
Really?
Usually, but if I had presented all of what is coming on one page, you would have left.
But I would have left on the second page as well.
Maybe so. But there's a higher chance of getting the user through something as long as this, if you break it into bits that make sense to them. Because, yeah, I quickly realized, okay, this is adding extra, so I just went and pressed next. Because all of what was in that page was about ordering something extra, and I knew I didn't want that, so I just went straight for the next. But if I had added something, little thing down here that weren't related to ordering something extra, then I would have missed that. That's why you have to group it together in chunks that make sense. Because then the next thing comes. That's about making your own card. Just go and press no thank you. I don't want that. I'll just have a regular card on there. And then you get to who's actually receiving these flowers and how and when and where. Also group together, that's something that belongs together. So these, yes, this is about selling more, but let's not fool ourselves. E-commerce is about selling more. So of course they're going to try that. But if you are going to try that, please try not to bother the user any more than highly necessary with it. Don't overwhelm them. Make it into steps like this that are grouped nicely together, because then they can quickly skip the parts that they don't want. And then finally, of course, who are you? And then the payment form. This is another example. Everybody has seen this one, printer settings. And this one has all of the basic stuff that you need for your printer. So how many pages are you printing? Are you printing all? Blah, blah, blah. But if you're a more advanced user and you have some specific needs, like I want it double-sided, or I want it landscape mode, or whatever, then I go into that one and I get that opportunity. And if I'm even more specific, I actually have that one as well. And I can go in here and I can start really messing with the little details. But if you go back a bit, then that one, it doesn't bother the users that don't need it. Same with that one. It doesn't bother the users who need it. So make levels according to your user's experience level. This paper prototype testing, I mentioned it earlier. When you have drawn screens of what you're about to make, we want to make sure that we might have agreed that this is what we're making and this is a good thing to make, but you might want to run it by your users first and make sure that they can actually use it. This is a prototype test, paper prototype test of a website where you can decide when you want your leave. He's having paternity leave, I think. So he fills in a date. And at first you think, okay, this is a bit like kindergarten, it's paper everywhere, and nobody will really believe that's a system. But everybody has played Makebelieve when they were kids. So that stick in the garden, that was a sword. And that wooden clubhouse was a castle. So you don't need much to make people believe that this is a website. You don't need much to actually make them interact with it. He has a pen, and that will act as keyboard and as a mouse. So he'll press on stuff with the cap on, or he will write a date if he needs it. And as you can see, there's just stuff flying in. So it's a manual computer. Even if we've forgotten something, if there's some of the cutouts that we haven't thought about making, we'll put in a piece of paper with an hourglass on it, and then we'll draw it on the side and fill it in. You can actually realize a lot. So yeah, he wasn't sure what was going on there. He got an error message, and he's trying to correct the error. I think he actually makes an error again. Then you know there's something here I need to look at, because he tried 3 times before he got it right. What can't you get out of a paper prototyping test? What you can't get out of a prototyping test is performance, for instance. Anything that is related to how the user internally works with this, you cannot test. But you can test the user interface. You can test if the model that you have built of the website, if that matches the mental model of the user. And that's all I had. Questions?
So you said about you want to kind of think about what the perfect system would be and all money spent. So often we have problems where they will come up with an idea, but for user experience, but when it comes to the accessibility person, says no, you can't do that because it's not accessible for whatever reason. Is it acceptable to come in early and say that, or should you wait and let the creative process flow before coming in with accessibility problems?
I would definitely let the creative process flow. And then, because it's, of course, all sorts of ideas that are not even feasible will come up at a workshop like that. You don't want to shoot them down because you don't want to break the creative process. You want people to think big thoughts that day. And if you keep shooting it down every time people come up with stuff, they're going to stop coming up with stuff. Yeah. So don't shoot anything down. You can think to yourself, you can make a mental note that there's something there about accessibility that we have to look at before that will work. Or, yeah, I know you would like that, but that's not even technically possible at the moment. But just make a mental note of it, and then see how much of the idea you can actually work with.
I guess if you see everyone going down a path that's wrong.
Of course, if you can see they're headed straight into a dead end, you want to stop them. But be careful with how many ideas you shoot down, because you really want to get them creative, and you want them to think that they can contribute. And if you keep shooting things down, they don't think they have anything to offer anymore. Yeah?
I was just wondering, when you put people together in these groups, making all this creative stuff, most people attending the workshop is not used to working in that manner. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So, do you do any kind of warm-up exercise or anything like that before you actually go and do the workshop?
That's a good question. That's actually a good question. I didn't mention that while I was talking about the creative workshop. A creative workshop requires a good facilitator. It requires somebody that goes first. So whenever people are talking about ideas, because at first they won't grab any crayons and they won't start drawing on their own because they are not used to working like that, and it's not the adult way of behaving. So I will grab the crayon and I will start drawing and say, did you mean something like this? And then quite fast, if I get it wrong, he'll take the crayon and say, no, I would want the button down here instead, blah, 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 blah. Because then we're talking based on what I had just drawn, and I had pulled him in. But it means that you have to go first. You have to not only show them how it's done, but also show them that you're not brilliant at drawing, so don't be ashamed of your own drawing skills, because we are all equal here. And if you are good at drawing, try hiding it a bit. Yeah?
So if you have, say, a group of 12 people, what's a good average size to split them up in smaller groups?
If you have like 12 people, I would make 3 groups of 4. Because there's usually at least 4 different caps like developers, designers, users, domain experts. And I would have one of each in each group. So if you have 12, make 3 groups of 4. If you have 10, make 3 groups of 3 and 1 of 4, and so on and so forth. It doesn't have to be completely equal size groups. Just make it approximately 3 to 4 people each group. But you can go too low in participants. I wouldn't go below 6 participants because you don't have enough different roles represented then. And then, of course, whatever they come up with of suggestions will be skewed towards what their preference is. So you want them to be able to ping pong off each other. So somewhere between 6 and 12 is usually a good workshop size. Yeah, there was somebody down here, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, do you have any hard figures to convince management? Because from a resource perspective, it seems like a lot of wasted effort. Don't take the wrong, but having developers who could do great iPhone apps.
It's a good question because it's something that people are often faced with. Even if they want to do something like this, management says, well, unless you can show me some figures that this paid off in the end, then we're not putting money into it. And I didn't go particularly into it, but there's a book, and I can't remember the title right now. Cost-effective something. See me afterwards and I'll find the title for you. But there are books written on the subject of how to convince management that this is a good idea. Because, yeah, let's face it, none of this will fly if your management won't go for it. That's blatantly, that's how the world rolls, basically. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you come up with these 256 cards?
No, usually, if you're making a website, for instance, you have a fairly good idea at this point in the design process of what you want on your website. Your management has stuff they want on there. There are certain groups in your company that want to make sure that whatever they are good at is advertised. You want to have, the usual stuff about the history of the company and contact us and press and jobs. And so you can quite easily come up with a pool of what you want on your website. Even if you don't have the full amount of content of your website at that point, you will still have the structure and you can start fitting whatever comes after into that structure and add that to the groups after. Of course you should have most, because if you have less than half then it doesn't make sense, and there might be full groups of menu points that you're missing. Yeah.
So what I mean is it independent functionality? Is it pages or?
Yeah, it's pages. It's basically your sitemap. It's everything in your sitemap broken into.
It wasn't a website. What was the scope then?
Well, if it was an app, for instance, then you would have your menu points there. Suppose the Facebook app. Okay, on the Facebook app, I want my timeline, and I want to be able to search my friends, and I want whatever points you have in possibilities you have in Facebook, and then you can start grouping that. You can do that for basically anything, because any system has some sort of sitemap. Any system has, you can draw a workflow like I had earlier. And then each of those screens would be one of the points. Yeah?
Do you combine the technique with user stories or use cases in order to derive more specifically what?
That's certainly possible. Use cases and user stories is a very good tool as well, but since I had to keep to 50 minutes, I had to choose some of the methods that I have found the most useful. And the reason I did not choose use cases and user stories is not because it's not very useful and very informative, but because most people actually are using that already. It's one of the more known techniques, and I wanted to introduce to you some of the lesser known techniques. But it's a very good technique, yeah, definitely. Anyone else? Yeah.
You often have the case that you change an existing process, or...
Could you speak up?
Sorry, often it's the case that you have to change an existing process or web page.
Yes.
How do you deal with that? Are you going to go completely blank into it and do a complete read?
It depends. It depends. If what you're looking for is a revolution rather than an evolution, then I would go blank and just scrap what you have and start from scratch. If you're more looking at evolving something that's already existing, then I would definitely do a test of what you already have. Do a user test of what you already have. Find out what works and what doesn't work in that. And then, of course, fix what doesn't work. And whatever you find that really works well, be sure to have that in your new system or site or program or whatever it is. And another way of informing something like that is also look at what your competitors are doing. And I'm not, everybody is so saint-like, but it didn't, I mean, good people, they get inspired. Great people, they steal. That's what they say. And I think it's right. I mean, today to come up with something that has never ever been seen before, you might go an entire lifetime without being able to do that. And there's no point. If people have already invented something that works really well, why not get inspired by that and then fit it to whatever it is you're doing? So look at your competitors, even look at related fields that have something that might work in your field. Get inspired. All right, I think that was the last question then.